about one of America's guiding principles. Everybody knows about this, the constitutional principle of civilian control of our military, very much a cornerstone of our republic. This fundamental principle of self-government may have been in jeopardy during the final days of the Trump administration. But before I get to that, I will provide a historical context. That principle became part of the American fabric on June the 14th, 1775, when the Congress of the Continental Congress appointed George Washington commander of the Continental Army. His commission ordered him to report to civilian authorities. It specified, and I want to quote, "You," meaning the new General Washington, you are to punctually observe such orders and directions from time to time as you shall receive from this or a future Congress of these United Colonies," end of quote. Well, he followed that. At war's end, General Washington gave this principle lasting purpose, and he did it with power and grace. On December 23, 1783, in a solemn ceremony at the State House in Annapolis, George Washington voluntarily surrendered his commission, as well as his military power, to civilian authority, the President of the Continental Congress. The scene is memorialized in a dramatic John Trumbull painting that is displayed in the rotunda not far from here. And all of my colleagues go through that part of this Capitol every day. Probably don't pay a lot of attention to it, but it's an important description of a basic constitutional principles. Now, we know that there's other ways of doing these things in other countries. We know that dictators rule their nation with an iron fist because they control the sword. Washington selflessly laid down that sword to ensure America's destiny for generations to come. He chose to disband the Army and return to private life at Mount Vernon. And one scholar explained it this way, quote, "The Virginian went home to plow," end of quote. By this noble act, Washington cemented a crown jewel of self-rule, civilian control of the military. 5 years later, as Washington was elected president, this bedrock principle was enshrined in our Constitution. While this governing rule is essential to the preservation of democracy, it has been challenged with grave consequences. The Truman-MacArthur dispute over conducting the Korean War is a case in point. President Truman wanted to limit the war. General MacArthur disagreed. General MacArthur defied orders, and General MacArthur criticized his commander-in-chief, Truman's decision, and he did that publicly. So Truman fired him for insubordination. Now I want to get to the main purpose of coming to the floor. Recently, several books, including a book entitled Peril by Bob Woodward and Robert Costa, suggests that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, may have trampled on this principle. The book Peril provides an alarming account of his words and deeds. Milley told the authors he was, quote unquote, certain that the commander-in-chief was, quote, in serious mental decline and could go rogue and order military action or the use of nuclear weapons, end of quote. Now, Milley, I'm quoting again from the book, Milley felt no absolute certainty the military could control or trust the president. So, end of quote. So Milley, further quoting, in his words, took any and all necessary precautions. His job, he said, was, and I quote, to think the unthinkable. And his words, pull a Schlesinger. To his words, contain Trump. He had to, quote, inject a second opinion, end quote. His opinion was then injected into the command structure. In doing so, he may have stepped out of his lane as the president's principal military advisor and into the statutory chain of command where law doesn't allow him to go. Because by law, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has no command authority. When President Nixon faced a crisis over impeachment and resignation, Secretary of Defense Schlesinger feared that he might order an unprovoked nuclear strike. So he, Schlesinger, reportedly took extra legal steps to prevent it. Now, that's the same Schlesinger that Milley referred to as he was being interviewed for this book. Now, it happens that pulling a Milley as opposed to a Schlesinger is a very different kettle of fish. A four-star general can't, quote unquote, pull a Schlesinger. Schlesinger was at the top of the chain of command, just below the president. He kept the president's constitutional command authority firmly in civilian hands as the Constitution requires. Milley allegedly placed military hands, his hands, on control that belonged exclusively to the president. According to Peril, that's the book I'm referring to, he summoned senior operation officers in the military command center to his office. He had them take, quote unquote, an oath not to, quote unquote, act on the president's orders without checking with him first. These brazen words and actions, if accurate, strike at the heart of our democracy, civilian control of the military. They turn this guiding rule upside down and show utter contempt for the commander-in-chief. Coming from the nation's top general, they're dangerous and contrary to Military Code 10, U.S. Code 888. After describing military's action, the book's authors rightly asked this question, quote, was he subverting the president, question mark? Had he overstepped his authority and taken extraordinary power for himself, question mark, end of quote. Milley assured this senator in a letter to this senator that his actions were on the up and up. The book, however, seems to imply a different story. Now, at a hearing where the general was, Senator Blackburn asked him about the mismatch. He replied, quote, I haven't read any of the books, so I don't know, end of quote. She said to him, read them and report back to us. He said, absolutely. He agreed, quote unquote, happy to do that. 9 months later, he's still dodging the question with the same lame excuse. To crank up the pressure, I joined Senators Paul and Blackburn a few months ago in a letter pushing for a straight answer. When none came, I began sending handwritten notes to the general. I soon received a 10-page letter from General Milley that ignored the question. My second note sparked an email. It claimed that our letter did not raise, quote unquote, a direct question, and asserted, quote, General Milley answered the specific questions, end of quote. Now, I think I can legitimately ask, is that Pentagon baloney, or what is it? After my third note, General Milley responded with the same old smoke and mirrors routine, quote unquote, I have never read the books. Years of oversight have taught me this lesson. Evasive answers usually offer revealing clues about the truth. I think General Milley knows better. He knows the score. If those books and all attendant press coverage of those books had contained gross misrepresentations, we would have heard about it a long time ago. He would have hammered the authors and corrected the record. However, to date, not a peep from the general. His silence speaks volumes. Something doesn't smell just right. As the Pentagon watchdog, when I get a whiff of wrongdoing, I sink in my teeth and don't let go. So Congressman Jim Banks, a member of the House Armed Services Committee, and I upped the ante on April the 11th with 12 pointed questions that we gave General Milley a second bite at the apple to clear the air. Now, 2.5 months later, we still have no response. General Milley, you said you were going to answer for Senator Blackburn's question. Honor your word. Answer the questions. Come clean with the American people. We are all ears. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator for Virginia.
Mr. President,